There is a kind of woman the frontier never quite knew what to do with. Not a wife, not a widow, not young enough to be pitied, and not old enough to be invisible. Just a woman alone in a house at the edge of a town that had already made up its mind about her. Willa Crane was that kind of woman. She had lived in Harrow Creek for 37 years, and in all that time, the town had never once asked her if she needed anything. The autumn of 1882 came in hard and early. The hills above the creek went brown before September was out, and the first frost arrived on a Thursday, the way bad news often does, without warning and without apology. The cottonwoods lost their leaves in a single night. The road through town turned to iron under the wagon wheels. And somewhere out on the eastern pass, a man on a tired horse was riding toward a decision he did not yet know he was going to make. Some things cannot be explained by the conditions that produce them. A woman bakes bread she does not need. A man fixes a fence that is not his to fix. A lamp stays lit in a window long after there is any practical reason to keep it burning. These are not large gestures. They are not meant to be seen. But they are the kinds of things that, taken together, over time, in the cold and the quiet of a hard country, add up to something that has no name and does not need one. The town of Harrow Creek had its opinions. Towns like that always do. It had its women who kept accounts of other people's lives in the ledgers of their conversation, and it had its men who stood outside the feed store and said very little but missed nothing. When a stranger began appearing at the edge of Willa Crane's property, those ledgers opened. Those eyes turned. And the question the town asked itself was not whether the woman was in danger. The question the town asked was whether she deserved to be helped at all. What happened between a spinster and an outlaw on the cold edge of a small and judgmental town was not a scandal, though the town tried to make it one. It was not a rescue, though rescue was part of it. It was something quieter and more durable than either of those things. It was two people, each of whom the world had decided it was finished with, finding out that the world had been wrong. This is that story. Harrow Creek was the kind of town that knew everything about everyone and said most of it out loud. It sat in a shallow valley between two brown ridges, with a single main street of plank-fronted buildings and a church at the north end, whose bell had not worked right since '79. There was a livery, a general store, a post office no bigger than a pantry, and a saloon that opened early and closed late and pretended to be neither. The creek itself ran along the eastern edge of town, narrow and cold, and in October it ran slower, as though it too was tired. Everything in Harrow Creek moved a little slower in October. Willa Crane lived at the far end of the South Road, past the last house that counted as part of town, in a clapboard farmhouse that her father had built in '61 and never quite finished. The porch rail was uneven. One shutter hung at an angle. The garden in front was neat enough in summer, but by the time October arrived, it looked like most honest things look when the season turns. Stripped down, unglamorous, still standing. Willa kept chickens in a small wire pen beside the house, and a single mule named George in a lean-to shed that leaned a little more each year. She drew her own water and split her own wood and bought very little from the general store, because she had very little to buy with. This was not a secret. In a town like Harrow Creek, nothing was a secret. She had never married. That was the first thing people said about her, and for most of them it was also the last. She was 37 years old in the autumn of 1882, which was not ancient by any reasonable measure. But in Harrow Creek it was late enough to settle the question for good. The women her age had children in school. Some had grandchildren. They had husbands who sat in the same chair every evening and wore grooves into the porch boards and complained about their backs. And Willa had none of that, and the town had decided, somewhere along the way, that this was either her fault or her punishment, and it was not always clear which they thought it was. What was clear was that they had stopped expecting anything to change. They had written her into the ledger of finished things, and they did not often revisit that page. Her father, Edmund Crane, had died in the spring of '78. He had been a quiet man who kept to himself and asked nothing of the town and received approximately nothing in return. He had left Willa the house and the mule and $11 in a tobacco tin beneath the floorboard of the bedroom, and she had made it last longer than anyone would have expected, because she was careful, the way people are careful when there is no one to ask for more. She took in mending when it was offered. She grew most of what she ate. She kept a calendar on the kitchen wall and crossed off the days not with excitement, but with the steady practice of a woman who understood that accounting for time was the same as respecting it. The Thursday that began the change came in the last week of October. It came the way all significant Thursdays do, dressed like an ordinary day, unremarkable until it wasn't. The frost had arrived the night before, the first hard frost of the season, and Willa had woken before light to find the window above the sink laced with ice on the inside. She had built up the fire and stood with her hands around her coffee cup and looked out at the pasture going gray in the early dark, and there had been nothing in the morning to suggest it would be any different from the mornings before it. The chickens needed feeding. The water needed hauling. The wood she had stacked along the south wall of the house was lower than she liked, and she made a note, the way she made all notes, without alarm, but without pretending the thing was not there. She went to town that morning for the first time in 2 weeks. She needed lamp oil and a spool of heavy thread and, if there was enough left over, a small measure of molasses. She walked the south road with her shawl pulled close and her basket on her arm, and she passed the houses of women who had been girls with her once, and one of them raised a hand from her doorway, and Willa raised hers in return, and that was the whole of it. At the general store, a man named Aldous Pritchard weighed out her order without much conversation, which was fine with Willa, because she had learned that the conversations in Pritchard's store were rarely about the things they appeared to be about. She paid with the coins she had counted out the night before, collected her basket, and walked home the same way she had come. That evening she lit the lamp in the front window. She did this every night, had done it since her father died, and she had never been able to say exactly why. He was not coming back. There was no one expected. The road past the house went nowhere useful after dark, and she was not a woman who was afraid of the dark, so it was not for her own comfort, not entirely. It was something older than reason. A habit that had become a kind of statement, though she could not have said what exactly it was stating. She set the lamp in the window, and it threw a long yellow rectangle across the frost-stiffened ground in front of the porch, and the night settled in around it, and Willa went back to her mending. The town had its opinions about the lamp, too. Aldine Hurst, who lived on the near side of the creek and whose opinions were the kind that traveled without being sent, had said once, in the hearing of several women, that keeping a lamp lit in an empty house was either vanity or an invitation, and she was not sure which was worse. The women had not disagreed with her, because disagreeing with Aldine Hurst required more energy than most of them had to spare on the subject of Willa Crane. And so the lamp burned every night, and the town thought what it thought. And Willa did not change what she did, because she had learned, somewhere in the long quiet of her life alone, that other people's opinions were like the wind off the ridge in November, constant, cold, and not a thing you could stop by noticing it. Some things are too small to explain and too large to put down. The lamp was one of those things. She kept it lit because not keeping it lit felt like agreeing with something she was not willing to agree with. She was not finished. The house was not empty. She was there, and she was awake. And the light in the window was the simplest way she knew to say so. The frost lay on the ground. The mule shifted in his shed. The creek ran thin and dark along the edge of the valley, and the stars above Harrow Creek were very clear and very far away, the way they always are in a high country when the air turns cold. Inside the house the fire held, the lamp held, and Willa Crane sat with her needle and her thread and her crossed-off calendar, and did not know yet that Thursday had only just begun to show itself for what it was. He came on a Friday evening, which was the day after the Thursday that had seemed so ordinary and turned out not to be. Willa had been in the side yard, pulling the last of the dead beanstalks from the garden bed before the ground froze them in permanently when she heard the horse on the south road. She did not look up right away. Horses passed on that road sometimes, though not often after dark, and she had learned long ago that looking up too quickly at things on that road had a way of making her seem like a woman who was waiting for something. She was not waiting for anything. She finished the row before she straightened and turned. The horse had stopped at the edge of her property, just beyond the fence line, as though it understood the boundary without being told. It was a dark animal, heavy-shouldered, with the look of a horse that had been ridden hard and fed inconsistently, and had learned to be grateful for rest wherever rest appeared. The man on it was leaning forward slightly, not in the way of a man about to move, but in the way a man leans when he has been in the saddle a long time and his body has made its peace with the position. He was watching her. Not the way a man watches a woman he is assessing. The way a man looks at something he is trying to place, careful and without urgency, as though he has time for the question, even if he does not have time for much else. Willa looked back at him for a moment. Then she said, without particular warmth or alarm, "Are you hungry?" It was not quite a question the way she said it. It was something between a question and a statement of available fact. The way a practical woman speaks when she has already done the calculation, and the answer is yes, either way. The man was quiet for a moment. Then he said he did not want to impose. She said it was no imposition. She had supper on and there was enough. He did not say thank you, not right away, but something in the set of his shoulders changed, very slightly. The way a thing settles when it has been held up by effort and the effort is no longer required. She did not invite him inside. She brought a plate to the porch step, salt pork and boiled potatoes and a piece of cornbread, and a cup of coffee that was strong because she made it strong and had never thought to make it otherwise. He sat on the step to eat, which she had not expected, and she sat in the porch chair behind him with her own plate, and they ate without talking, which suited them both well enough. He ate the way a man eats when he is hungry, but does not want to appear to be, steadily and without rushing, and he did not leave anything on the plate. When he was done, he held the plate and the cup as though uncertain what to do with them, and she took them from him, and he said thank you. Then, quietly, and she nodded and went inside. He was gone when she came back to the door to set the lamp in the window. The horse was gone from the fence line. The road was empty and dark, and the frost was already forming again on the ground, and there was nothing to indicate that anyone had been there at all except for the two flat places on the porch step where his boots had rested. Willa looked at those places for a moment. Then she set the lamp in the window and went to bed. He came back the next evening, and the one after that. He never arrived before dusk and never stayed past full dark, and he never once tried the door or stepped onto the porch uninvited. He tied the horse at the fence post and waited, and Willa would bring a plate, and they would eat, him on the step and her in the chair, and the conversation, when there was any, was brief and practical. She asked him once if he was passing through. He said he was not sure. She accepted that the way she accepted most things, without pressing it. His name, he said, was Cole. He offered nothing after it, no family name, no town of origin, no explanation for where he had come from or where he had intended to go. Willa did not ask. She had lived long enough to know that a man who volunteers nothing is either private or careful, and either way the information would come or it would not, and asking rarely made it come faster. She called him Cole, and he called her ma'am, and that was the whole of their address to one another for the first 2 weeks, and it was enough. Harrow Creek noticed, of course. A town like that has 100 eyes, and all of them are open. Aldine Hurst saw the horse at the fence line on the 3rd evening from the window of her cousin's house on the Ridge Road, and by the following morning it was in the Ledger. By the end of the week, the story had gone through the usual alterations that stories go through in small towns. It had grown in some places and been compressed in others, and the version that came back around to Willa through the single woman at the post office who still spoke to her directly was that there was a man visiting every night, and no one knew who he was or where he had come from, and people were talking. Willa thanked the woman for telling her. She did not change anything she was doing. Joshua Merritt, who ran the general store in partnership with Aldous Pritchard, and who had an interest in most things that happened in Harrow Creek that he could not entirely account for by ordinary civic concern, came down the South Road on a Wednesday afternoon and stood at Willa's fence for a time. He said he had heard she had a visitor in the evenings. She said she fed a hungry man when one came by, the same as any person ought to do. Merritt said he understood that, but people were uncertain about the man, and uncertain people sometimes made things difficult for their neighbors without meaning to. Willa looked at him the way a woman looks at a man who is telling her something that sounds like concern but moves like a warning. She said she would keep that in mind. Merritt stood at the fence a moment longer, then tipped his hat and walked back up the road, and Willa went inside and put more wood on the fire. Cole did not come that Wednesday evening. He came Thursday, same as the first time, and Willa brought the plate without comment, and they ate in their usual arrangement, and the night was cold and clear. At some point during the meal she asked him, without turning to look at him, whether anyone had spoken to him in town. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said 1 or 2 people had looked at him in a way that spoke for itself. She nodded. She said, quietly and without drama, that he was welcome at her table the same as before. He did not answer, but he finished his coffee, and he did not leave any faster than he usually did. And when he was gone, the plate was on the step, set down clean and careful, the cup balanced on top of it, the way a man leaves things when he has been raised to leave things right. The fence post at the northeast corner of Willa's property had been leaning since August, when a late summer storm had loosened the ground around its base and left it tilted at an angle that was not quite fallen but was no longer useful. She had noted it the way she noted all the things that needed doing, without urgency, but without forgetting. There were only so many hours and only so much she could manage alone, and the fence post was lower on the list than the wood and the water and the mending that kept the coins coming in. It leaned. She looked at it. She moved on. One morning in the 2nd week of November, she came out to feed the chickens, and the post was straight. It had been reset in fresh-packed earth, tamped down firm, with a flat stone wedged at the base the way an experienced man wedges a stone, not hastily, but with the understanding of how ground moves in a freeze. She stood and looked at it for a moment. She had not heard anything in the night. She had not asked for anything. She went and fed the chickens and came back inside and said nothing about it to anyone because there was no one to say it to. The week after that, the window above the dry sink, the one that had let in a thin ribbon of cold air since September, through a gap where the frame had warped, was sealed. She found it on a Tuesday morning, a thin bead of fresh putty along the lower edge, neat and unhurried, the work of a man who knew how a window ought to sit in its frame. Cole had not mentioned it. She had not mentioned it. That evening when he came, she brought the plate and they ate in the usual silence, and at no point did either of them refer to the window or the fence post or the fact that something was changing in the arrangement between them, because some things do not require naming to be understood. He was, she had come to understand, a man who moved the way water moves around a stone. finding the necessary path without drawing attention to the motion. He did not announce himself. He did not linger where he was not wanted. He appeared at the fence line at dusk, and he was gone by full dark, and in between he ate what she offered and said what was necessary and nothing more. But the work on the property accumulated quietly, the way snow accumulates when you are not watching. The porch rail that had wobbled since spring was mortised back into place. A split in the lean-to roof where the mule sheltered was patched with cedar shingles. The gate latch, which had required lifting and pulling at a particular angle to open, was adjusted to a clean, single motion. He never did these things while she was watching. He never referred to them afterward. She did not know what to call what was happening. She was a woman who had spent 20 years being precise about what things were and were not, because imprecision in a life as narrow as hers had consequences. But this did not fit neatly into any of the categories she had maintained. He was not a hired hand. He was not a suitor, or if he was one who had not announced the candidacy. He was a man who came to her fence at dusk and ate her cooking and fixed her fence posts and did not ask for anything, and she had no word for that, so she stopped looking for one. Joshua Merritt came back on a Thursday. He did not stop at the fence this time. He came to the door, which was a different kind of visit, and he knocked with the particular knock of a man who has decided he has authority in a matter that is not his. Willa opened the door. Merritt said he needed to tell her something about the man she was feeding. He said Cole was known in 2 counties to the east, that there was a notice on him for something that had happened in a town called Redfield 3 years prior. He said he was not telling her to frighten her, but to be a good neighbor. He said the word neighbor the way some people say it, as a container for something else entirely. Willa asked him what the notice was for. Merritt said horse theft, possibly worse, and that the details were not his to know. Willa looked at him for a moment in the way a woman looks when she is deciding how much of what she thinks to let show. Then she thanked him for coming and closed the door without haste. She thought about it that evening. She sat with her mending and turned it over, the way she turned over things that mattered. Quietly, without rushing to a position. She thought about the fence post and the window putty and the cedar shingles on the lean-to roof. She thought about a man sitting on a porch step eating salt pork and potatoes and leaving the plate set down clean. She thought about the notice in 2 counties to the east and the town called Redfield. She did not know what had happened in Redfield. She did not know if the notice was just or unjust or somewhere in the long, difficult country between the two. What she knew was what she had seen, and what she had seen was not a dangerous man. It was a tired one. When Cole came that evening, she did not mention Merritt. She brought the plate and the coffee and sat in her chair and let the silence settle the way it always did. But at some point, without looking at him, she said that she had heard his name had come up in conversation around town. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said that he supposed it would. She said she was not asking him to explain himself. He said he understood that. She said that she was telling him so that he knew what he was walking into when he came down the South Road, and that if he came anyway, she would feed him the same as before. He looked at her then, briefly, the way a man looks at something that has surprised him in a way he does not know how to account for. He did not say anything. He finished his coffee. The moment at the woodpile came on a Saturday when she was stacking the new cord he had split that afternoon while she was inside. She came around the corner of the house with her arms full, and he was already there, stacking, and they nearly ran into one another in the narrow space between the stack and the south wall. They both stopped. They were close enough that her shoulder was almost against his arm, not touching, but near enough that the cold air between them was a thin thing. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then she set her wood on the stack and he moved to give her room, and the moment passed, the way those moments do, without resolution, carrying everything it had accumulated and depositing it somewhere below language, in the place where decisions are made before a person knows they are making them. The Friday that settled everything came in the third week of November, when the pass above Harrow Creek had already taken its first real snow, and the road east was the kind of road a man looks at and makes a decision about. Willa knew the passes. She had lived her whole life in that valley, and she understood what November meant for a man on a horse with no particular shelter arranged. The window of leaving narrows fast in that country once the cold takes hold, and then it closes, and a man who has not gone is a man who has stayed, whether he intended to or not. She thought about this. She did not say it to anyone. She was at the dry sink on that Friday morning when she heard the horse in her corral. Not on the road, not at the fence line. In the corral, where George the mule stood in his patient and incurious way, and where no other animal had stood in 4 years. She dried her hands and walked to the window that now sat flush and sealed in its frame and looked out. Cole's dark horse was standing at the far rail of the corral. Cole was not in sight. The horse was unsaddled. The saddle and the worn leather bags that hung from it were draped over the top rail, not in the way of a man making a temporary arrangement, but in the way of a man who has put a thing where it belongs. Willa stood at the window for a moment, then she put the kettle on. He appeared at the porch an hour later, having done something with the morning that she did not ask about, and she opened the door, and he came in for the first time, because she held the door, and the gesture was plain. He took off his hat at the threshold, and held it at his side and stood in her kitchen, with the look of a man who is aware that he is somewhere he has not been before, and is trying to be worthy of the fact. She set a cup of coffee on the table. He sat down. It was the first time he had sat at her table, and he sat the way a man sits when he is not certain he has the right, but is hoping the offer means he does. She sat across from him. They drank their coffee. Outside, through the kitchen window, the 2 horses stood together in the cold corral, and the frost on the pasture grass caught the thin morning light and held it. She set a second place at supper that evening without comment. There was no ceremony to it. She took a plate from the shelf and set it across from hers and put the fork beside it, and that was the whole of the declaration. He came in when she called and sat down, and she put the food on the table, and they ate together for the first time, inside. At the table her father had built in '63 from boards he had milled himself, and the fire was going in the hearth, and the lamp was lit on the shelf, and the kitchen was warm in the particular way a kitchen is warm when it is feeding more than one person. Some things do not need to be said. Some things are said more completely by a plate set on a table than by anything a mouth could form. Joshua Merritt came one last time on the following Tuesday. He stood at the fence because Willa did not open the gate, and he said he wanted to be sure she understood what she was doing. She said she understood it fine. He said the man was still wanted in the East and that this was not something that would simply go away. She said that most things people wanted to go away did not, in her experience, and that she had made her peace with that some time ago. Merritt looked at her the way a man looks at a woman who is not behaving the way he expected and is deciding whether to press further or cut his losses. He cut his losses. He said he hoped she knew what she was about. She said she believed she did. He walked back up the road, and she watched him go, and then she went inside and put more wood on the fire. Aldine Hurst said her piece to 3 women at the dry goods counter on a Wednesday, and the women listened and nodded in the way that women listen and nod when they are waiting for the speaking to stop so that they can move on to the rest of their day. The piece Aldine said was sharp and certain, and contained several words about reputation and foolishness, and what certain women bring upon themselves. The 3 women nodded. Then they collected their parcels and went home to their suppers. And the next time any of them saw Willa Crane in town, and she raised her hand from the south road, 2 of the 3 raised theirs back. It was a small thing. It was not nothing. In Harrow Creek, a raised hand from across the road was about as close to an apology as the town was ever going to offer, and Willa accepted it for what it was. The weeks that followed were quiet in the way that good things are quiet, not empty, but settled. Cole worked the property with the steady application of a man who has found a use for his hands that he did not have before. He was not loud about it, and he was not demonstrative. He fixed what needed fixing and left alone what did not, and in the evenings he sat at the table that Edmund Crane had built and ate what Willa cooked. And sometimes they talked, and sometimes they did not, and both were comfortable. One evening, near the end of November, she was washing the supper dishes, and he was sitting by the fire with a piece of harness leather he was mending, and she said, without turning from the sink, that she was glad he had stayed. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he was too. That was the whole of it. It was enough. Some things are too large for naming, and the ones that are tend to last longer than the ones that get named too soon. The corner of his mouth moved once on a Thursday evening in early December, when she put a dish of dried apple preserves on the table without explanation. A thing she had been saving since September and had not opened for any prior occasion. He looked at the dish and then at her, and then back at the dish. And that corner of his mouth moved in the way it moved when something had reached him that he had not prepared a defense against. She sat down and served herself, and did not make anything of it. And he served himself, and did not make anything of it. And they ate the preserves by the fire, and the wind moved in the pines outside, and the lamp burned on the shelf, and the horse and the mule stood together in the corral in the cold, and the night was very still. The frost came in hard that December, and the pass closed before Christmas, and the road east became a thing that existed on maps and in memory, and not in any practical sense until spring. And Cole was there when it closed, and he was there when the first real snow came down off the ridge and filled the ruts in the south road, and made the whole valley white and quiet. And he was there in the mornings, when the fire needed building, and in the evenings, when the lamp needed lighting. And Willa Crane, who had spent 20 years being the woman the town had already finished with, found that she was not finished at all. She was, in fact, only just beginning. And the lamp burned in the window every night, the same as always. Only now it was not a statement of solitary endurance. Now it was simply a light in a house where two people lived, and the night came in around it, the same as it always had. And the world continued. The fire burned in the hearth, and the snow lay on the pasture, and the two horses stood in the corral with their breath rising in the cold air, and the pines along the ridge held their quiet, and the creek ran slow under a skin of ice, and the chimney sent its smoke straight up into a sky that was very clear and very cold, and full of more stars than any one person could account for. And the lamp in the window of the Crane farmhouse on the south road of Harrow Creek threw its long yellow light out across the frozen ground, the same as it had done every night for 4 years. Only now, when Cole came to the window sometimes and looked out at the dark, the light fell across his face too, and it fit him the same as it fit everything else in that house, as though it had always been meant to. And that was the story of Willa Crane and the man called Cole. A woman who asked one question on a cold October evening and spent the rest of her life finding out what the answer was worth. And a man who rode toward a closed pass and chose a kitchen table instead, and neither of them ever had cause to regret the choosing. Let me know in the comments how this one felt. I hope it found you well. See you in the next one.